All right, hey everybody. We're going to be doing an intro to design thinking today, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. That was a great intro. Go ahead. So I'm a tutor, a UX tutor for Career Foundry. I've worked for Career Foundry almost 2 years now. I'm a career specialist, content writer, as well as I'm on the mentor advisory board. And I consider myself a bit of a non-traditional UX designer, and that means that I've just had several boot camp experiences, GA, Block, and I work with Career Foundry. I've worked with companies, agencies, and startups in the design field, which is a bit of a different way of approaching it. And I'm currently a digital nomad living in Vietnam. And also, I would love to hear where everyone's from, so you can drop a line of where you are in the world. So I'm going to go over a bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So what is design thinking will be the first thing, and I'll give a clear definition of what that is. And then we'll also go into the process of design thinking. So we'll define each phase, and then I'll give you some questions you can ask to help get yourself in the right mindset of each phase. Then we'll go over some pitfalls to avoid. Then we'll talk about the value of design thinking once we know what it is and how to go through the process. And then we'll talk about UX design versus design thinking. Then at the end, I'll give a few of my favorite examples of design thinking. It's going to be really enjoyable. But first, I want to go over assumptions. This is a good place to start in any design process, and it's a good place to start when teaching design. So what I hear when I teach design or design thinking or anything design related are usually four things, one of four things. And it's, I can't really draw, I'm way too old, I'm way too young, I don't have experience, or I hear my favorite, I'm not creative. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think back when you were a kid. So we're born creative, and we're born without doubts about our artistic skill. And what happens is over time, one experience or several experiences change that. And also after about second grade, imagination, it just stops being acceptable altogether. And then as adults, we're put in this position where we have to kind of crawl our way back to our creative origin. And so what it is you have to tap into your own particular way of accessing creativity. And for me, sometimes I do weird things like put on rose-colored glasses or hang upside down or take a walk. You can do something simple like that. But like I said, it's a process and it takes time. So your first idea is not going to be, boom, this revolutionary iPhone, whatever it is that you think is going to just happen out of your process. It takes time. And a good example of this is, so I was watching the Magic School Bus with my daughter, and Miss Frizzle, Liz, Ralphie, I hope everyone knows that. But I was watching Magic School Bus, and some way or another they found themselves in this cloud, and they were trying to figure out how to get out. So one kid turns to Ralphie and they're like, think. And so what Ralphie does is he starts throwing these ideas out, just anything that comes to mind. So updraft, rain, heat, water, freezing, and he just throws all these ideas until he finally stumbles upon the one that gets them out of this cloud. And so that's a good example of how the design process works. Is it's not this straightforward thing. Sometimes you go straight, left, back, up, down, right. And that's what you have to accept. So allow yourself the time to get there. And another great way to think about it is, what are the traits of a successful design thinker? So you have curiosity, your collaborative skills, being flexible, and also being brave enough to express those ideas in a group setting. So let's get right into it. What is design thinking? So design thinking is both an ideology and a process. It's all about solving complex issues in a user-centric way. So design thinking was created as a way of taking the process and approaches of designers and using them to solve problems that designers don't typically encounter. So it's the mindset of a designer applied to these problems. And what you'll often find is the problems are defined as wicked problems. And so what a wicked problem is a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. So that's a really big difference that you have to focus on, is what types of problems that design thinking focuses on. And I'll explain what a wicked problem is. I feel like that's not a good breakdown, but it's a good definition. So the difference between these problems is, let's take a complex problem, for instance. So this would be like playing chess. And what you have to do in chess is take the other person's king and defend your own. And it's pretty straightforward game with pretty straightforward rules. But a wicked problem, let's say, is how to properly educate a child. So you have to now think, well, what does it mean to educate a child properly? What does that look like? What is the end result? Will it work for all children? From subject to subject. So physical science versus social studies, and testing in different environments. So there's so many other factors. And even if you solve one, another problem occurs. So that's the difference between a regular problem, or even just a complex problem, or a wicked problem. So the next thing I want to talk about is this quote from Linda Nyman, the CEO of Creativity at Work. She has a great quote, and it says, "Design thinking draws on logic, imagination, intuition, and systemic reasoning to explore the possibilities of what could be and to create desired outcomes that benefit the end user." And so design mindset is not problem focused, it's solution focused and action oriented. So it involves both analysis and imagination. And I really thought that was a good quote. But what you want to take from it is the types of problems. So the designer's mindset applied to these wicked problems. And so we'll talk a little bit about the origins of design thinking. Where did it come from? So the thing is, design thinking wasn't really created. It's always been around in practice, but I believe there's a few noteworthy names to mention. And the first will be Tim Brown. So he's acknowledged as the person who coined the phrase design thinking. And he's the former CEO of IDEO, a leading company in the design industry, a global design company. And IDEO stands for Innovation Design Engineering Organization. And so like I said, he also has several really good books. One in particular, Change by Design. I highly recommend that book. So if you can get your hands on that, definitely read that. The next person is Ralph Fast. He's the first person. He's a professor who was a professor at Stanford in the late 80s, early 90s, who was the first person to teach design thinking in an academic setting and as a way of solving practical problems. So that was another person I think is worth mentioning. The next is David Kelly. So he's one of the founders of IDEO, as well as the founder of the D School at Stanford. And he's also a huge advocate for design thinking and has a couple wonderful books, as well as a TED Talk that will bring you to tears. All right, so the next thing we'll be getting into is the phases of design thinking, or the process. And if you Google design thinking, this is typically what you'll find, the image of these hexagons lined up. And the process is typically divided into 5 phases: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. So even though it looks like a straight line, you have to understand that it's not a linear process. So after each phase, you'll need to redefine and reassess your previous goals and assumptions. So you have to go back. And there's also a lot of complexity in each phase, as well as a lot of overlap. So I'll try not to go too deep, I'll just give you the basic, just general understanding of each phase and how it works. So phase number 1, the empathize phase. So this is spent getting to know your user and the problems they face. So you observe them and engage with them to understand them on an emotional and psychological level. And so let's say you don't know your user, or you're not aware of the industry. What you would do is called preliminary or preparatory research. And this is pretty much just taking the time to get to know the industry, get to know competitors, similar products, comparable experiences, or other services that are in that industry. Let's see. And so the questions you want to be asking during this phase is, who are your users? What are their thoughts? What are their goals, their aspirations? You're just taking the time to get to know them. And it's very important to note this. I cannot stress this enough. Only through proper research can we know what the user is thinking and feeling. It's all things beyond that, beyond proper research, are just guesses, assumptions, or pretty much arrogance. You want to leave those out of your process. I'm telling you, this is very important. Proper research. So the tools for this phase, for the empathize phase, these are just a few. There are several, but you can do group interviews. You can do as-is scenarios, and this is IBM's tool. So what you do is you map out what the user is currently experiencing, like step by step. Mind mapping, where you take a general concept and you trace the terms out and connect them. Empathy mapping, where you figure out what the user is thinking, feeling, and doing. And you have the user in the center. It's like a quadrant. You've seen empathy maps before. And then obstacles. So the things to avoid, pitfalls during the empathize phase. So one thing that I constantly encountered, and most of the time I was working with startups, is just skipping the empathize phase, just feeling like it's not necessary. So half of my job was convincing the CEO of the importance of research. And sometimes you can get valid insights from the CEO and interviewing them, but it's always best to go straight to the source and remind them that they are not the user. The next thing is just having too many assumptions and assuming that you know what they're thinking. It's very helpful to remember not to judge what you observe, but to ask questions, question everything. So even if you find an insight, ask the user why, and continue to ask why, and validate your observation through their own understanding and not your assumption of what it is that you think you're seeing. So the next thing is phase number 2. So define. And this is where you take all of the insights from the empathize phase and you start to put them together and get a sense of what the problem is and the needs of the user. And so pretty much it's just a synthesis of the data, and the end result is a problem statement. Okay. And so you're going to look for patterns, themes, relationships between the information. And if you're familiar with the UX process, it's comparable to analysis, the analysis phase. So like I said, once the data is synthesized, you'll create a problem statement. And the questions you want to ask during this phase are what difficulties and barriers is your user coming up against? What patterns do you observe? What do they actually need? And what is the big problem that needs to be solved? Okay. And so tools for this particular phase are storyboarding, where you map out, you draw, it's pretty much a visual of what your user is experiencing. You can do personas, where you take your insights from the entire group of users and you kind of boil them down to persona. You have prioritization matrices, where it's you have a quadrant of 4 and you start to group the problems and you pretty much base them off of like precedence, which one is more important than the next. And then big idea vignettes, where you have one idea and you kind of work backwards. So what would the solution look like? So if you already had the solution, what would the user's end result be and how would they feel? And that's where it's like working backwards. That's a really good tool. And so the obstacles of this phase. So having too broad or too narrow of a focus. And so if it's too narrow, you miss out on opportunities. And if it's too broad, your problem becomes too convoluted. And so the next obstacle is just not framing your problem statement in a user-centric way. And an example would be elderly women between the age of 65 and 75 need a cheap and effective form of self-defense. No, that's just a joke. But seriously, the way you want to frame it is elderly women in suburban areas between the age of 65 and 75 need fast and accessible ways to get to their doctor's appointments. So you're putting it in terms that the user will understand, as well as you understanding, and you're pinpointing who's the user, where they are, demographics, and what they need. Let's see. So phase number 3. And so at this point, it's time to get creative. So this is where you begin to generate the ideas for that innovative solution. And remember that no idea is a bad idea, or having no idea is a bad idea, or no idea. So this particular phase is split in 2, but most of the time you'll see that it's not, they have it lumped together. But I believe there's a difference between creating an idea and deciding on an idea. In a group setting, it's a bit difficult because, you know, when you're by yourself, you can pick whatever it is that you like, but the skill for deciding on an idea in a group setting is definitely something I think is important to separate and distinguish. Let's see. So a good quote, a really good quote, David Kelly, founder of IDEO, is if you want to have a good idea, have many ideas. And I completely agree with this. I completely agree. Don't throw anything out just yet, and just build and build and go for volume. And so questions you want to ask during this phase, and I like this particular image because it's probably one of the most intimidating things for me as a designer, is just this blank canvas of what you can create. And so I wanted to share that. But the questions you want to ask is, what will wow them? What outside of what's realistic will wow them? And also take into consideration the data that you have. So the question you can ask is, with all the data I've gathered, what solution could solve one or more of the user's problems? And then you can kind of pinpoint ways to combine problems later. You want to focus on one at a time. Definitely focus on one at a time. And the next in ideate, tools for ideation, the ideation process are time boxing, where you split up your group and everyone goes in separate ways and takes like a minute and they come back. And then you have brainstorming. And we all know what brainstorming is, but I think it's important to take the time to look into best practices for brainstorming. Like how to facilitate an environment where everyone feels comfortable with sharing is definitely something that is important to know. So look into some best practices of brainstorming, even though we all know what it is. Sketching, so just having a visual of what it is, the idea, it kind of helps to draw it out instead of just have it written. And dot voting. So this is once you've narrowed down, once you've narrowed down your solution, you can vote. So if you're in a group and everyone is given 3 dots, you have 10 ideas. And so everyone would put a dot on the idea that they think should move to the next phase. And at the end, whichever has the most dots is the one that moves on. So it kind of alleviates that the issue of one person thinking that this is more important than the next, and the group coming together and deciding. So the pitfalls or obstacles to avoid is just simply not thinking outside the box, not really digging deep for those innovative ideas, and throwing out too many. And so the next thing is not deferring judgment. And like I said, with brainstorming and having that environment where you facilitate the comfort, the safe space to generate ideas, and encouraging the wild ones and not thinking hyper realistically. So those are the pitfalls of the ideation phase. And now phase number 4. Is everyone awake? Just want to make sure that everyone is awake and still here with me. All right, so phase number 4, prototype. So this is where you turn your idea into a tangible product, a rough model, or a sketch. And prototypes are pretty much a scaled down version of your product, and the way that your user will respond to it will depend on whether it's going to be rejected, reconstructed, or accepted. And let me say that prototypes should not take much time to make. The goal of a prototype is not to have a working model, but to give form to an idea. And that's the important part. It could be, I think there was a story where it was a simple prototype for a mouse, and it was literally like a piece of clay with a pencil in it or something like that. I'm not sure which company that was, but the story I heard of how simple your prototype can be. And we'll get into some obstacles of how prototypes tend to be a bit too complex. I'll talk about that. Another side note is that some designers or some design thinkers believe that the first iteration in your process is not valid until you get to a prototype. So until you have a working or a model where your user can interact with it, it's not valid. And I don't agree with this, but I understand why there's this belief. I believe that any time spent with the user is valuable, but it's extremely important. The information you get when you see the user do something you didn't expect, or even break something, it's just that information is it carries so much more weight than, you know, well, for me at least, taking that time to see them interact with your product. And also another thing is on multifunctional teams, prototypes can sometimes be misinterpreted or misunderstood. So like what an MBA and what an engineer and marketers believe are prototypes are different than what designers believe. So it's good when you are working in a group with different people is to go ahead and clear that expectation of what the prototype is supposed to do. So like I said, giving form to an idea. And questions to ask during this phase are, what features does the prototype need to communicate to the customer? And what can be removed? So not having too much complexity and making sure that you focus in on what it is that you need to test with this prototype. And so let me give a few examples of that. Or first, let me start with the tools that you need in the prototyping, or you can use in the prototyping phase. So pencil and paper, simple. If you're going for like a digital platform, Figma's good. Go Mockingbird is good. It's another platform for wires. 3D modeling software is also good, and just anything you have available is also good. Any tools or any materials. And so here's an example of that. So you see on the left a foam mouse, and just they're probably testing for the ergonomics of the mouse and how it feels in your hand. And adding too much fidelity to that would probably be like adding a wire and trying to figure out what kind of material for the wire, as well as adding a clickable button, or trying to figure out what color at the bottom of the mouse should be. So just we're trying to see what the shape is and how it fits in the user's hand. And then you'll see at the top, right, there's a camera, cardboard camera, and just seeing like where things are going to be on the camera and how the hand fits on the camera. And also it not taking so much time, as well as it's being a cost-effective way, or a cost-effective prototype, and not taking too many resources. And you can see the clay model for a car is a really good material because it's cheap, and you can get so much of it, and it's not, like I said, it's inexpensive. So let's go over the obstacles of this phase. Like I said, adding too much complexity to a prototype and not honing in on what it is that you're actually testing for, and spending too much time or too much money on a prototype. It's supposed to be a quick process. All right, and now we're down to the last phase number 5. This is test. So it's pretty much just exactly as it sounds. You test your solution, you invite your user to respond and interact with your prototype, and this will inform you to whether you need to kill your idea or move forward. And you don't want to, if you need to kill your idea, you don't want to have to invest additional resources. And we'll talk more about that in the pitfalls. But the questions you want to be asking during this phase is the solution useful? Is it usable? Is it desirable, efficient, and effective? And how does the user feel about your idea? And what feedback do you have? And listening to that feedback. I can't stress that enough. All right, so tools for testing. You can do user-centric.com, Hotjar, or just maintaining that access to the person that you're designing for at all times. Let's go ahead and... All right, so a really good story about testing. So Sony was testing which boombox, and this is a boombox. They don't sell boomboxes anymore. but it's a really good story. So Sony was testing which boombox color do customers prefer. They had a white one and they had a black one, and so they brought in this group of people, and everyone's excited, and they're like, Sony just simply asks, which one would you buy? And so everyone's like, the white one, the white one. And I mean, everyone's excited about it, and so what they do is as a thank you. So Sony is like, on your way out the door, you can take one of the boom boxes. You can take one of the boom boxes home as a thank you for coming out, and have a nice day. And every person grabbed the black one. And so what it says, and what I'm trying to focus on, is that the actions of your user speak louder than the things that they say. Because when you ask someone what it is that they want and they tell you, that's one thing. But when they show you what they want, it's a completely different thing, because they didn't know they were going home with the white or the black one. They weren't spending any money. There was no connection. It was just a question. But when you create that level of interaction where they have to go home with the one that they pick, so now you know which one that if they take the time to think about, would be the one that they would choose. And it's just listening to those things. So the obstacles that I have is listening to the action of what the user is saying to you during this testing phase. Another big thing is also I found with startups that the lack of funding sometimes can be an issue, because if you don't have the time to go back and iterate on what it is that you need to, you'll want to push your product forward regardless of whether or not the tests reveal that maybe there's not a market for it, or maybe the idea that you chose to go forward with is just not right for your user. It's just not being able to go back and start from scratch, or start from a earlier phase. So that's one of the pitfalls I found. And so now we'll get into the value of design thinking. So we know what design thinking is, and we know the phases of design thinking, but now let's get into the value. So its value lies in its user-centric focus. So just allowing you to really hone in on those pain points or those frictions so you can solve the right problems. So then your customers get exactly what they want, and they'll buy more because it's exactly what they want. So it pretty much makes two parties. It's the connection between two parties and making sure that they're connecting in the right way. And so it also helps non-designers deal with the ambiguous problems through a structured process. And design thinking is usually incorporated in technology and education, but it can be just as effective in services and manufacturing. So it can help improve the processes, as well as the productivity and internal operations. You can also solve things like issues relating to corporate culture or quality of life problems, problems affecting diverse groups of people, and pretty much problems that can't be solved with data alone. And corporations like IBM, Apple, J&J are using design thinking as a way to evolve the way that they innovate in the products that they create. And the focus of innovation. So it's a quote from Linda Nyman again. The focus of innovation has shifted from being engineering driven to design driven, from product centric to customer centric, and marketing focused to user experience focused. That's another great quote by Linda Nyman. But what I really want you to think about is that design thinking helps non-designers deal with the ambiguity through a use of a structured process. That's the value of design thinking. And the next thing we'll be getting into is user experience versus design thinking. So we know what design thinking is, but we haven't gone over what UX is. So that's a good place to start. So UX is another design process, but its sole objective is creating a great experience, or creating a design system with a great experience. And UX focuses more on the interactions a user has with a product, and it's typically used in a digital space, but it can be applied to tangible products. And so UX also incorporates many aspects of design thinking, like understanding the user, using research, ideation, having an ideation process, rapid prototyping, and testing with the user as well. So there's a lot of overlap in UX and design thinking, but both are pretty much user-centric and have similar toolkits. However, the impact of design thinking is a bit different. And so the easiest way to think about it is design thinking is focusing on the solution, and UX is focusing on the design of that solution. So again, it would be like if you found that your user needed a digital platform to solve a particular problem, UX would help you to make sure that that platform gives you a pleasant experience and doesn't have as many friction. So the difference is it's very subtle. So design thinking is more of a systems level thing, and it deals with wicked problems, like I said. But it's also important to understand that design thinking is more about the creative process and validating ideas before they're implemented. UX goes into the details of the design, like the human interactions of it, like graphic designs and the interactions with the product. But that's pretty much the difference between the two. And another really big difference to keep in mind is the way that they were introduced to the corporate world. So design thinking was introduced as a way to improve ROI, to innovate, to improve corporate culture, and pretty much increase productivity. Whereas UX was introduced as a way, not even as a way, but kind of like through IT and through tech. So it's just kind of a thing that those designers do or those tech guys do. It wasn't the value of it wasn't introduced first. It was just kind of like, those techie guys over there. So stakeholders and board members are more likely to accept design thinking, or the term design thinking, than UX, even though there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of value in both. And so what we'll go over first, we'll start to go into the examples. And I want to talk about Amtrak as the first one. So, make sure everyone's awake. Everyone out there is awake, right? Good? Cool. So let's go on to get into these examples. It's like my favorite part. So Amtrak reached out to IDEO to work on the seats of their new trains. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to create a better experience when the user gets on the train and they have a pleasant ride, and that's what their focus was. But what IDEO did was they started to research and storyboard the process from when the user buys their ticket to when they get off the plane, get off the train and they're at their destination. And what they found was there were 10 points of contact from ticket to hotel. And of those 10, I believe 8 weren't even on the train. So what they found is that it would make more sense to focus on that aspect as opposed to just the seats on the train. And a lot of times what you'll find is that the problem that you're designing for initially is not the one that has or carries the most weight with what the user wants. So they still design the seats, but it was just showing that you need to also look that you also may find that what you're looking at isn't what needs to be solved for the user initially. And so the next example, and this is one of my favorites, this is IDE in Cambodia wanted to improve water sanitation in rural Cambodia. I'm not sure if you've heard of this. This is probably one of my favorites. But what was happening was the water quality in Cambodia was really bad, and children were dying. It was, I think, like 11,000 children were dying from dehydration and diarrhea every year. And so they wanted to improve the water quality. And what they did was they reached out to the locals to figure out what was going on. And what it was is that they were using the restroom in the fields. And so they sat down with the locals to ask, like, what is going on? Why is this happening? Why don't you have access to toilets? Or why is the field the more preferable option? And what they found is that they just didn't have access, but also that toilets weren't being manufactured because the manufacturers weren't really making sales because no one was buying them. And it was the convenience of it as well. Is that the field is right there, so why would I go to a toilet? But another bit of research they found was that the average income, I believe, was around 185 USD. So it was like to buy a toilet would be a complete just waste in that mind or in that space. And so what they did is they came up with a design for a toilet that would be cost effective. So $15 for the initial investment. It could be scaled. So you make the initial investment of $15, but as you invest in it, you can add, an outhouse. You can add another ring, and the rings are pretty much to increase the quantity of what you can store. And they created a very inexpensive, easy to make, easy to assemble toilet. But on top of that, and this is the beautiful part, is that they found that education was another aspect, like not only just designing the toilet, but showing the people how much feces was collecting and how it was affecting the environment that they were living in. So they used sand as a way to show the buildup. So they put like pictures on a tarp of all the places that the locals were using the bathroom, and they would tell them to place sand every time, and it would show that over time this is building up. And so they created that connection, and they created that connection by educating as well. And I feel like that was something that I think most people wouldn't have come up with just thinking like, oh, we need to just design a toilet, but also to educate, which is a beautiful thing. And so here's another picture of the manufacturer making it, and that was a big part. Is it has to be something that can be easily made on site. And I was watching a video, and the manufacturer was saying that even a widow can put this together. And he was saying that it was just so easy to make. And I feel like this is a beautiful story. I love it. And the last example I would get into is our beloved Netflix. And if anyone remembers Blockbuster at some point and how it deteriorated into nothing, then you'll really appreciate this example. So I consider Netflix one of the most revolutionary, I guess, companies in the past century. Like they started off as like a mail service. You could get DVDs directly to your door, and there was no penalty, no late fee, which was pretty revolutionary at the time. So you didn't have to go anywhere, and you can get most of what you wanted directly to your door. So that pretty much put them in a different space immediately in, I think it's late 90s. But then what happened is cable companies started to offer streaming through just, cable box. You can just get a movie, pay $2, and you can get the movie right there. You don't have to go, you don't have to order, you don't have to do anything. It's right there in the convenience of your home. But what they did is that Netflix pivoted, and instead of just offering mailed-in movies, they offered a watch now button. And so for $8 a month, you could now watch at least 1% of their entire library, which was about 7,000 movies, which is a lot for $8. And that completely changed. But not only did they add that, and they didn't stop there, they started to add AI and predictive analytics to their software, to their platform. And then they still didn't stop there, and they started to look at what kind of content that users wanted, and seeing what kind of and creating their own content, which was a huge step for Netflix as well. And then also creating completely improving their software. Completely improving their software. So when you scroll, trailers will play, and that engagement and finding ways to connect with people. And also now Netflix is pretty much like a part of our everyday just culture. You know, Netflix and chill. You have the Netflix button on the remote. It's on every single platform, your TV, your laptop, your tablet. And it's just finding the way to constantly engage and never sitting still, or just finding ways to improve what it is that you have. And so I find that Netflix and their pivots are just amazing. So that's it for my presentation, an intro to design thinking. But as a closing, I just wanted to talk about something that design thinking is extremely beneficial. However, it's not a golden ticket. And I know, I don't know if most of you know the statistic that 90% of startups fail, and they still incorporate these methodologies into their corporations. But the thing is, it's not just process, it's about execution. And so execution is everything. And there was one quote I found that said that culture eats process for lunch. And what that pretty much means is that regardless of how much you want to incorporate design thinking into your organization or your group, the culture of that group trumps everything. So not being able to introduce research where everyone doesn't see the importance, or not facilitating brainstorming and, you know, trashing other people's ideas. It doesn't matter how much you know about design thinking if you cannot create an environment where it blossoms. And so another thing too is it doesn't matter. Anyone can be a design thinker. You just have to learn, and you also have to take the time. It's pretty much just developing the determination to want to learn these things and really apply them and practice them. You don't need fancy glasses or anything to be a design thinker. You just need to understand your unique perspective, and also be willing to share it and willing to listen as well. And so you can be a line cook, an Uber driver, it doesn't really matter. So that's my closing, and thank you. So let's see.
Camren?
So we'll actually go into some questions. Let's see, I think we have like 2 minutes. Someone said RIP Blockbuster. So I'll definitely look into some questions and see what people are asking. Yeah. Tips for becoming a digital nomad. Let's see. What's your opinion on user experience with autoplay videos? The rule used to be not to have anything autoplay. Now it seems that it's everywhere. On top of that, it seems to follow you down the page and you scroll past. Ugh, that's a good question. Let's the concepts learning in school. Culture eats process for lunch. Yeah, man. Let's see. So, let's see. Oh, can I talk about being a digital nomad in Vietnam? It's great. Love it. I don't want to. I really. I want to kind of stick to the topic of design thinking. Let's see. But I'll definitely. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn if you like, and we can discuss it further. I don't have a problem talking about that.
Camren, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. Well, yeah, just wanted to say thank you for this. And we have some other questions related to design thinking. And just for those who want to find out about Camren's story, yeah, we'll link you up to his Instagram profile so you can reach out directly. Maybe let's start with some alternatives to design thinking. So what are alternatives to this process?
Alternatives to design thinking. So when you mean alternatives, like
I guess maybe, you know, there's obviously Design Sprint, for example, that was developed by Google, and I guess I think a company here in Berlin, they run a version of design thinking, but they skip I think one of the parts. I don't remember. I don't want to say which one at the moment, but some companies, for example, I know skip research completely.
Yeah, which is terrible. I don't. And actually, that's one of the things is when I was working with a lot of startups is when we skipped the research phase, it was like it was known why we were skipping it because we didn't even look at whether or not there's a market for what it is that we're designing. And so that's the first thing I do whenever someone asks me, like a startup wants to reach out to me for a job, is I ask, well, how did you decide that there was a market for what it is that you're designing? And so when you talk about other methodologies like the sprint, they're not contradictory. You can use these methodologies together. Like I was saying with UX versus design thinking is that one is to design one is to figure out what problem, and the other is to design that problem and make sure that there's not as many frictions and you iterate. So they're not contradictory. So you can really incorporate several methods together.
And I guess it just seems like such a complex process. Do you know? Can you tell us like how long it takes usually to go from A to B?
So it's based off of what the company sees as like values, because there's never enough time. There's never enough time. There's never enough resources. It's really, like I said, it's how much the company values the project. So if they want it done in a certain time, then usually you have to get it done in that time period. But if you're given more time, it's still valuable. It's not like you just have to do this in 1 month or 3 months. It's just because it's not something that you can put a time limit on.
Mm-hmm.
It's constantly going to be something you need to improve. It's constantly something
right.
that you have to keep adding. So I'd say there is no time limit, but it's all about funding too, because you have to make sure that you don't just spend all the money, you actually get things done. So yeah, it's all dependent upon the company.
And what about the research phase? Would you be able to tell us how much time you should spend there, or maybe how many users you should be looking at?
So I think the standard is 5. I think it's 5 that you need to be able to move forward with anything. Is you need at least 5 participants to interview with, and the time period that it takes, because you're always coming back. A lot of times what you do is you're going through and you realize that there's a lot of assumptions or there are things that you don't know. So you'll get to the define phase and you have to go right back and ask yourself, well, wait a minute, now I need to go re-interview this person, or I need to find more interviews, more participants to interview. Or you may get to the end and then now you have more questions that you've unearthed. It's like research is constantly something that you're incorporating in almost every phase. So it's hard to describe it because it's not a linear process, like I said, and it's different for every single project that you do. And I think it's kind of dangerous to try to put it in this structure because it's so fluid. And that's why it really takes a lot of practice. And I'd say I'm not even completely there because I'm still learning so many different things from so many people who've done it so often. So I would say that design thinking is never going to be that structured process. And then when it does, it's just not going to work anymore.
Mm-hmm. Maybe for those who want to read a tiny bit more about design thinking and how it all goes, I'm going to post this blog post that we published on our blog. But let's keep going with more questions from the audience. How does the design thinking process apply in Agile Scrum projects?
Oh, say that again?
How does the design thinking process apply in Agile or Scrum projects?
I have this. because it's similar to, like I was saying, with the methodologies not contradicting one another. Is that you can use this process to develop a software, but at each phase of development or the way that you want to think about it, you can still incorporate the different toolkits that you have with design thinking. And what you'll find too is that people are practicing it without even knowing. So when you really, like I've seen interviews where they'll ask people, do you know what design thinking is? And they're like, no. And then they'll explain what it is that they do, and they're still incorporating it. So it doesn't matter what methodology you're using, you can still mesh them together, if that makes sense.
I think so. Let's go with another question. For further education, what one book and channel to follow would you recommend, both design thinking and UX? Do you have any book recommendations?
Yes, I do. There's one I recommended Change by Design, which you can either get the physical book or the audio book is available. There's another one that talks about, it's David Kelly's book. It's creativity. I cannot remember the name of this book. Let me find it real quick. I have it. I just have to finish it. I was reading several books. Let me see. Yeah, that's what it is. Creative Confidence. That's the one that I was going to get to. Creative Confidence.
From IDEO, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a really great book. We'll also add these to the email I'm going to send tomorrow, so you have a reference.
Let me say that if anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn and discuss anything beyond design thinking, I'm welcome to that as well. It's okay. I see a lot of comments about things that have nothing to do with design thinking.
Could you talk a bit about what to look for in a design thinking qualification? What are important things to look for? What are good platforms? How important is branding?
That seems like, because branding would be more of like, it's more of a design thing, especially with you doing like the proper research of like what it is that you're trying to express with your brand. So like you would want to get feedback. Can you repeat the question again? I think there was like several things in that question.
Yeah, so I think first part is about design thinking qualification. What is important to look for? What are some good platforms? And how important is branding?
So when you ask platforms like for learning design thinking?
Yeah, maybe. If the person is still in the room, if you could clarify what you mean by branding. Is it branding of the platform?
Like designing branding for a company or
exactly
yourself, or But
let's move on. We have a question about personas. How many personas is ideal for a project? Do you create a persona for every archetype, user group identified?
I usually do two. I usually do a primary and a secondary, and that's about it. And sometimes you can do a third if you have like someone that you need to design for. Like, let's say you're doing a double-sided like platform where you have two types of users on one side, but then you also have like someone that user is communicating with on another. Then you would do like three personas, two for one side and one for the other.
Great. Do business analysts also work through design thinking? How does it differ from UX design?
Yes, and when you say business analyst, we're not talking about like analytics. We're talking about someone like more business focused, like an MBA? Like, what do you mean by business?
I think so. Yeah.
Well, I think the important thing to say, I guess, in that question is that anyone can participate in design thinking and actually bring valuable information with them. It's just they have to be able to pull it out. It's having the unique perspectives in a group is what makes design thinking such a great process. So you may have a group of people who have contradictory ideas, but they didn't even realize that their idea was an opinion or an assumption until they met each other. So it's always good to have like a diverse group of people on a project and never have the same minds in the room. So that's didn't really answer the question, but it's important to know.
And I think we have time for one more question. And I just love this question from Grace. How do you convince the company to do design thinking before launching or creating a product? So how do you present the value of design thinking to your boss?
That is a great question because it does not work all the time. But I like to give examples of some successes, and most of the time it's the same when you are designing a platform for someone. You need to use research to validate any of your designs. So having examples is usually the best thing to do, and try to get them involved in the process as much as possible. So try to include them in everything that you do. If you can, like, reach out to them and let them know why you're doing things. Is this is before you get the client, or is this as you're trying to figure out? Because that's like two different things.
I think before you start working on a project, before you start working on the product. Oh,
so let me say that I personally don't take projects if I cannot question what it is that you're designing. If it doesn't go through, like, I have a screening process. So I would say don't take every project, and have that make sure that the person that you're trying to design for is actually someone you can work for and work well with, because, like I said, culture eats process. So some people you just aren't going to be able to convince. They just don't care.
And with that positive note,
I'm sorry. I don't want to be unrealistic, because, like, you do work for someone that you just don't mesh well with. It's not going to go well, and you learn from those experiences. And I've had several projects I've had to drop, and it's just the truth.
Totally. I mean, yeah, that's true. And some clients are just so convinced that their idea is their idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it is beautiful to find those clients that you work well with. Let's say that. End it on a positive note. It is a beautiful thing when you find well.
That's what I was saying. Ending on the positive.
I'm
sorry. Camren, thank you so much for this. That was fantastic, and thank you all for joining us, for participating in the conversation. If you have any questions, either about Career Foundry or about design thinking, you can drop me an email or just message Camren on LinkedIn. As he said, tomorrow I'll be sending an email to all of you with the recording and with the slides, so you'll have them for future reference. We'll also add all these book titles that Camren just mentioned. So good morning, good evening, wherever you're based. I wish you a great rest of your day. Thanks.